When I was little, my dad once said to me, "You know, money does not grow on trees." And this made me very sad because I knew that somehow this agricultural problem meant that I was not going to get the video game that I really wanted. And in my disappointment, I failed to ask the obvious follow-up questions. If money does not grow on trees, then where does it grow? And how much of it have we grown, and why can't we grow more? So now it's been 30 years, and these questions finally occurred to me. So I went to my dad and I asked him these questions, and his response was something like, "I don't know." And that's more or less the response I get when I ask most people these questions. But somehow, when I ask my friends questions like, "Is the stock market going to go up?" then people have very different kind of response. They have very strong opinions and lots of reasons to back up their opinions. And that seems very strange to me because the prices of assets, after all, are the rate at which those assets are exchanged for money. And it seems hard to understand prices or have opinions about prices without knowing or being able to predict how the quantity of money is going to change. And that's what I want to talk about here. I want to talk about how much money is out there. Now, this is a topic I've addressed a few times in the videos I've released in the past, but here I want to dive into some subtleties that I've been thinking about recently that change the numbers based on how you define the quantities you're measuring here. The first subtlety is, exactly what should count as money. What counts as money? Now, for most people, there are several different kinds of financial instruments that we consider equivalent to cash. We think of bank deposits as equivalent to cash, and money market mutual funds. These are the funds that are in your investment account. We think of all of these as equivalent to cash. But in reality, they are not. When Silicon Valley Bank collapsed, for example, US holders of the bank deposits at Silicon Valley Bank were made whole. They received the cash that corresponded to their deposits. But foreign holders of those deposits did not. Okay, so those deposits are not exactly equivalent to cash. And that matters. And there are other ways in which they're not equivalent. The amount of cash that's out there is much more predictable in a sense than the amount of deposits that's out there. Because the Federal Reserve is a government agency that tries to be transparent about how much cash it's putting out there, and it's transparent about its plans for when it's going to release cash and take away cash from the system. Whereas the amount of bank deposits, this is a number that's determined by the actions of hundreds of private institutions that are making choices based on complicated incentives. Okay, so it's not entirely predictable how that number moves. So if you want to make predictions about the entire system, then it helps to understand which of these numbers are predictable and which might change dramatically over time without much warning. A second kind of issue here is exactly where are we looking for the money? We could measure the amount of money held by all institutions that are not the central bank. Okay, that makes sense. But we could also measure all of the institutions that are holding money that are private institutions. In particular, it's a question: should we include the cash held by the US government, by the Treasury of the US government. That's the difference between these two categories. And somehow, if you exclude or include the cash held by the Treasury, you get a significantly different picture for the amount of cash that's out there. And that's what I want to show you today. But first, let me briefly review how bank deposits and cash interact. So there are three kinds of institutions in the picture that I want to talk about. There's the Fed, there's banks, and private entities. And new cash can enter the system in one of two ways. The Fed can lend cash to the banks. Okay, this increases the amount of cash that's held at the banks. And if this money is repaid, then the process is reversed. The Fed can also create money and use it to buy assets, like Treasury bonds. And when it does that, the amount of cash that's in the rest of the system goes up. And if the Fed then sells those assets, the process is reversed. Now, there's a second kind of financial instrument that I want to talk about, and that's bank deposits. Bank deposits can be created when private entities deposit cash at the bank. This increases both the cash held at the banks and the deposits at the banks. But deposits can also be created when banks make loans to private entities. This increases the amount of deposits held at the banks, but does not increase the amount of cash. If the loans are repaid, this process is reversed. In fact, if you look at the amount of cash held at the banks versus the amount of deposits at the banks, then you see that the amount in the form of deposits is much larger than the amount in terms of cash. So most money was created during the process of the banks lending to private entities. Okay. So currently, the amount of cash is about 3.2 trillion, and the amount held in deposits is about $17 trillion. Okay. And then there's also a significant amount of money held in the form of money market mutual funds, which is captured by this red line. So most money that's out there was created by the banks during the process of lending. Now, in response to the problems with inflation, the Federal Reserve has been trying to reduce the amount of money that's out there. And it's been doing this by both raising interest rates to make it harder for banks to generate more deposits. And it's also been doing this by selling its assets to reduce the amount of cash that's out there. And we can try to measure the effect of these actions by looking at the amount of cash that's out there. But where should we look for the cash? And there's an important choice that we can make here. We can either include the Treasury of the US government, or we can exclude it. The Treasury of the US government is the institution that manages the spending of Congress. It's the institution that gets the money that's collected when taxes are paid, and it's the institution that's responsible for borrowing money to cover the deficit and also for spending the money that Congress allocates. So we could choose to either include the Treasury in our measurement of how much money is out there, or we can exclude it. And depending on what you do, you get two quite different numbers. So what I've shown in this picture, this picture includes three lines. The blue line measures the amount of assets held by the Federal Reserve. The green line measures the amount of cash that's held in the Treasury's account. And the red line is the difference between these two numbers. So it's the amount of assets held by the Federal Reserve minus the cash held in the Treasury's account. For most of recent history, the Treasury was holding a very small amount of cash. And, generally in the US here, we run large deficits. So the Treasury generally owes money. So if it gets a lot of cash, it makes sense for it to repay some of its loans instead of holding on to the cash. And that's usually been true. And that means that the red line and the blue line have been tracking each other quite closely. And the Fed has been increasing over the last 10 years. It's generally been increasing the amount of assets that it's been holding, which means it's been injecting cash into the rest of the system. But then came the pandemic, 2020. And in response to the pandemic, the Fed made a massive injection of cash, okay, which is reflected in this big jump of this blue line, almost $3 trillion. But not all of this cash ended up in the hands of private entities. In fact, a significant fraction of this cash actually went to the Treasury and sat in the Treasury's account. Okay. So the actual amount of injection of cash is to private entities is what's captured by this red line. And it didn't jump as much as the blue line would suggest. What's happened in recent years, in the last couple of years, is that as the Fed, the Fed was first injecting cash up to this point, and then it began its quantitative tightening program to reduce the amount of cash in the system by selling assets. So it started doing that. But as it was doing that, the Treasury also drew down the size of its account, which meant that from the perspective of the private entities that are outside of the government, the amount of cash was actually staying roughly stable during this period. Okay. And all of that was thrown a little bit out of whack when the Silicon Valley Bank crisis happened. In response to the crisis, the Fed once again injected a significant amount of cash in a short amount of time, and that cash was actually seen by private entities. Okay. All right, so where are we now? Well, we just had the debt ceiling crisis, and that meant that the Treasury was actually went down to the point where it almost had zero cash. Okay. So now we're at an interesting point where the Treasury does not have any more cash really to inject into the system to cancel out the cash that the Fed is planning to take out. And the Fed's stated plan is to continue taking cash out of the system. And while that has not really been seen by private entities in over the last year, now it seems likely that the private sector will see that cash starting to disappear. Now, is that going to continue? Well, it's very hard to predict, because as we saw when Silicon Valley Bank had its crisis, the Fed reversed course and injected a large amount of cash. And so if there are multiple such failures in the banking system or in the financial system, it's not entirely clear how this is going to go. But I think it's very important to understand how these numbers are going to behave, or try to make predictions about them, if you want to try to understand how the entire system is going to behave in the years, in the months to come.